Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 119, and welcome to the first of two lectures that are designed to bring you into the contemporary era, to cover the last few decades of the 20th century and help you understand the America we now live in the 21st century. In these lectures, we're going to examine the 70s, 80s, 90s, and how a new economy developed in this period, and the effects that new economy had on American consumerism, and in particular, American consumer culture. In the early 1970s, the era of post-war affluence that has been our focus in so many lectures here in the second half of the class comes to an end. That booming economy that began with World War II and continued through the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, a period of relative affluence where Americans could find good-paying union jobs, buy a house, send their kids to college. That period, that post-war economic expansion, came to an abrupt halt in the early 1970s, and replacing it is the economy we all know today, one of uncertainty, one where American working families find themselves increasingly squeezed with declining wages and increasing prices for many mainstays of middle-class life: housing, education, healthcare. The very boom and bust, uncertain economy we now experience here in the 21st century began in the early 70s as an abrupt shift from that post-war affluence that had prevailed since World War II. Part of what fueled this shift in the American economy was global in its nature. After World War II, we rebuilt our enemies. We rebuilt Germany and Japan. In the Cold War, we wanted them close to us as allies to combat the Soviet Union. Well, by the early 1970s, Germany and Japan now emerged as rivals to the United States. After World War II, America benefited from the devastation that two world wars, World War I and World War II, had wrought on so much of the world. America thrived in the post-World War II period because it emerged out of those conflicts largely unscathed, with the exception of the attack at Pearl Harbor. The American homeland was never attacked in World War I or World War II, and so we could outcompete so much of Europe that had been decimated by those two wars. But after World War II, we rebuilt Europe. We rebuilt Japan, our rival in World War II, as part of our Cold War alliance system. Well, by the early 70s, Germany and Japan were now competitors in a globalized economy that would see the decline of American manufacturing, the decline of what has been the focus of this class, the industrial base of America. In our first lectures on the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, we talked about how in the late 19th, early 20th century, America fully and rapidly industrializes. Well, by the 1970s, we're facing competition from abroad, from Germany, Japan, an increasingly globalized economy, and that led to the decline of those good-paying manufacturing jobs that had once been the heart of that consumer culture of the post-World War II period. In 1971, for the first time, America now imported more than we exported, the first trade deficit of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, America was mass-producing goods that it sold to the world. In the post-World War II period, the 50s and 60s, we sold oil, automobiles, televisions, suits, and clothing to the world. In the 50s and 60s, we manufactured goods, refrigerators, and radios that were sold around the world. But beginning in the 1970s and continuing to this day, America would now import more than it exported. This is the beginning of the end of American manufacturing, the decline in American industrialization, what again had been the lifeblood of America's economy since the early 20th century. Now we would import cars, refrigerators, televisions from around the world, and this meant a steep decline in those working class, middle class jobs that allowed people a taste of the good life. As we have documented and discussed in many lectures, as we examine the 50s and 60s, a key era in American consumer culture, in those periods, union membership was over 50%. More than 50% of the American workforce was unionized. In those periods, what's often described as the golden age of the American middle class, someone with a high school diploma could find a good-paying union job turning bolts at the GM plant, buy a house, send their kids to college. Well, those good-paying union jobs for people with high school diplomas were evaporating in the 70s and 80s and replaced by service sector jobs, which, as we've already talked about and we'll talk a great deal more about in these final two lectures, offer less in terms of pay, no benefits, and they are very much captive to that boom and bust economy. So this is one indication here of what happens in the late 20th century. America loses its manufacturing base. Those jobs move overseas, or America faces competition from manufacturers around the globe. And with it, the percentage of the American workforce employed in manufacturing drops dramatically. Those people can no longer find good-paying jobs turning bolts at the local GM plant and instead find themselves in retail, home health care, hospitality, restaurants, fast food, low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs. That for them means the middle class ideal is indeed slipping away. America in the 1970s faced a number of economic hardships, including runaway inflation, part of it fueled by what we'll talk about in the next slide, great increases in energy costs. As gasoline prices rose, the price of goods around the country rose dramatically. The energy shocks of the 1970s really baldly advertised how dependent we were, our certain middle-class lifestyle, on cheap gasoline. Well, in the 70s, gasoline was no longer cheap, and that meant that everything trucked around the country. All the other consumer goods associated with cheap gasoline were now also expensive. So prices were rising dramatically. At the same time, people were facing this much more precarious economic reality. Also, the nation racked up very high deficits as a result of prosecuting the Cold War, particularly the very costly war in Vietnam, which led to, in the 70s, an austerity movement where the federal government was unwilling to pump money back into the economy. Another factor that we've talked a lot about that helps explain why America in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, in the mid-century period, was so successful and prosperous. Massive government spending. You had the New Deal. You had World War II. You had the Cold War and all sorts of efforts by the federal government to goose and stimulate the consumer economy. Well, in the 70s, facing high deficits and facing a conservative movement and a tax revolt, which we'll also talk about in lectures to come, the coffers of the federal government were now stressed and strained, and the federal government became less likely to spend money in a way that could have buoyed the American economy. So high deficits, high inflation. It was a period where, after an era of affluence, where the good life seemed to be at hand, accessible to all, that good life was now increasingly outside the grasp of working class and even middle class Americans. In response to runaway inflation and larger problems in the American economy associated with deindustrialization, the loss of our manufacturing base, President Nixon addressed those concerns in the consumer realm in relation to the consumer economy by imposing price freezes designed to stop massive inflation, but he coupled those with wage freezes. So now you're not getting paid anymore. The price of certain goods are to some extent frozen, but that led to scarcity. When producers of goods could no longer turn a profit, they made less and less of those goods. When they faced price freezes, it led to underproduction, underdevelopment, and scarcity. So you aren't getting paid anymore. You are facing high prices associated with scarce goods that weren't subject to price freezes, like imported oil with the energy shocks. And then you face scarcity. The American consumer, because of these price freezes, could no longer buy many of the products that once again were abundant. In the early 70s, Americans were waking up to a new reality. We would soon lose the war in Vietnam. In 1975, the last American troops leave Vietnam, America would suffer its first major military defeat. In the early 70s, you had the Watergate scandal that would force Nixon to resign, an expose of the rot and corruption within the American government. And then you had this terrible economy. In the early 70s, Americans were waking up to a new reality that seemed to indicate that the American dream, once so available, so accessible, was now increasingly out of one's grasp. Americans were waking up to this idea that maybe we aren't the most successful, powerful nation on earth, that there are limits to our power, as we see in the loss in Vietnam. Americans were now very circumspect, even cynical about our institutions as a result of the Watergate scandal. There were many traumas rippling through America, again, after a previous period of prosperity when that post-war ideal developed in America after World War II. However, now that era of affluence seemed to be slipping away. A big factor in that sense of an American affluence slipping away, the oil shocks of the 1970s. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, most of them in Southwest Asia, or what you might call the Middle East, decided to cut off the flow of oil in retaliation for America's support for Israel in the Middle East. In response to our support for Israel, the Arab nations in the Middle East retaliated by cutting off the spigot of oil, and in doing so, causing great trauma to the American economy. In 1973, the price of oil quadrupled, and with it came a huge spike in the price not only of gasoline, but also so many consumer goods that, again, were brought to your local retail store, grocery store, through trucking and a gas-based economy. America's vulnerability was baldly advertised with these oil shocks, a vulnerability that was based on an economy that really literally ran on cheap gasoline. As a result of the gas shortage, there were lines where Americans sat in their cars to buy the few gallons they were allowed to purchase. So this, again, was very demonstrative of a huge problem in America. It was yet another example of the weakness, vulnerability of the American dream. We had lost in Vietnam, Watergate scandal, jobs evaporating, and you're sitting for hours in your car just to buy a few gallons of gas at a now inflated price. And all this takes place again right after, as we've described in so many lectures, a period where it looked like the good life was at hand, where America lived in an era of relative affluence. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson launched his War on Poverty, where Americans were confident that perhaps by the end of that decade we could end poverty. We could really become a nation free from want. So in the 60s, we had great confidence. The American economy seemed to be booming, post-war affluence, the good life at hand. We're going to eradicate poverty. And then we move into this period of trauma after trauma. America, by the early 70s, was increasingly dependent on foreign oil. In the early and mid-20th century, we sold oil to the world. In the 1950s, America was the largest exporter of oil. But by the early 70s, we were now the largest importer of oil. And the efforts by OPEC to cut off the flow of oil, again, demonstrated how vulnerable this economy was. Not just its reliance on cheap gasoline, but how America was in many ways over a barrel to these countries in Southwest Asia that seemed to have us by the short hairs. The result of the oil shocks in the 1970s was a great boon to the American oil industry. As we've talked about in recent lectures, in the 60s there was the modern environmentalist movement. The effort to clean up pollution, clean up the air, passage of the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the first Earth Day. Well, in the 70s, a lot of those trends of environmentalism reverse. And a lot of restrictions that had been previously in place that limited drilling, offshore drilling, or drilling in certain preserves or reserves were relaxed, and now there was more drilling. The great beneficiary of the gas shortage and oil shocks 1970s was the American fossil fuel industry, because it put pressure on Congress to open up sites for drilling, to relax regulations. And so rather than take this as a moment to shift towards wind power, solar power, renewable energy, America, in its quest to hold on to an American dream slipping away, an American dream so dependent on cheap oil, we instead relaxed environmental regulations so that we could drill, baby, drill in our own backyard. In the late 70s, in 1979 in particular, OPEC once again cut off the flow of oil. This was in relation to the Iranian Revolution, revolution in Iran that ousted an American-sponsored dictator, the Shah. Since the 1950s, America had propped up in Iran a dictator, the Shah, as part of our Cold War strategy. And in the late 70s, young people in Iran, objecting to American influence in their country, rose up, and you had the Iranian Revolution. As part of that, the Iranian hostage crisis, where the embassy in Tehran was stormed by revolutionaries, and they held American citizens, employees of the State Department, hostage for more than a year. That itself was traumatizing to America. Once again, a visible indication of our vulnerability abroad. Not only had we lost in Vietnam, but now our citizens were being held hostage in Tehran when there was a failed effort to rescue them. That too went terrible and was another seemingly example of America's weakness and impetus. But then coupled with that revolution in Iran and the taking of American hostages, OPEC once again retaliated and cut off the flow of oil, which created another massive spike in prices with all the resulting trauma to the American consumer. This played a pivotal role in the upcoming presidential election of 1980, where the incumbent president, James Carter, was defeated by Ronald Reagan, who was able to, in many ways, criticize Carter for his bumbling of the crisis in Iran, as well as the very terrible economy of the 1970s that Reagan blamed on Carter and his policies. So the 1970s was a time of oil shocks, massive inflation, Americans sitting in long lines just to buy a few gallons of gas. It was the era where we lost in Vietnam, Watergate. And on top of that, threaded throughout that decade, was this bruising and terrible economy that saw job losses coupled with rising prices, a sense of the end of the American dream that had again prevailed for decades since World War II. In response to the oil shocks, there was an effort to urge Americans to be wise consumers, to conserve as a way of adapting to this new economic reality where the era of cheap gas and the lifestyle built upon it seemed to be no more. Part of this involved the advent of daylight savings time, an effort to reduce the amount of energy consumed in the summer by changing the clocks and elongating the days so that you did not need to flip on the light switch. Well, this made sense in a way to encourage conservation, to lessen the consumption of energy, but Americans really objected to this imposition, this effort to change the rhythms of the day and the tickings of the clock. It seemed like big government imposing itself in this fashion. Many people object to daylight savings time. They don't like losing an hour or the shift in the clock as we leap ahead in spring. If you are a parent of small children, you hate daylight savings time because it disrupts sleep patterns. If you work late at night or early in the morning, we're familiar today with how daylight savings and the changes to the clock are sometimes a real pain in the ass, right? But in the 70s, they were brand new. They were imposed by government. People objected for these reasons, and it also seemed to be a very futile effort. Rather than solve the underlying problems in the economy, help people hold on to those good-paying middle-class jobs, do something about rising prices, instead we got this imposition of daylight savings time. A lot of the messages coming out of government seemed to concede to this decline, that we had to live with it, that the new American consumption model would be one of less, that era of abundance that we had been promised since the New Deal, freedom from want, was now something we would have to forego in place of austerity, restraint, and conservation. So the message coming out of Washington in the 1970s was, well, we are dependent on foreign oil, and until we can ramp up our own production, Americans will have to go without. That was shocking, traumatizing, on top of all the other traumas we've enunciated in this lecture, and again, after a period in the 50s and 60s where it seemed like there would never be an end to abundance. And then these measures didn't really seem to matter much. If you turn down the thermostat in your home and put on a sweater, so rather than use energy to heat your home, you took these conservation measures. If you drove 55 instead of 65, if you did these things that the government was telling you to do to conserve energy, the bottom line impact on the family budget was pretty negligible. It didn't really have much of an impact. So the measures themselves seem to be, again, concessions to the new reality of going without. They were, again, markers of American weakness and decline. And then, tangibly, they didn't seem to make much of an impact. In the 1970s, the federal government imposed a speed limit of 55 and refused to allocate federal funds to states that would not adhere to that speed limit. And this was, again, an effort to urge conservation, to be a little bit less heavy on the gas pedal. Now, there were already market factors encouraging you to be less heavy on the gas pedal, the fact that gas was scarce and expensive. But in addition to that mechanism, there was this top-down measure coming from the federal government, the 55 mile per hour speed limit. And this was such a blow to Americans who, as we talked about in the 50s and 60s, had embraced the automobile as an icon of the good life, that era of autotopia, where people avidly took to motoring around the country, where Americans bought big tuna boat sedans and enjoyed those big cars as markers of opulence and the good life, or sports cars that were designed to go fast and consume a great deal of gas. In the 50s and 60s, those big tuna boat sedans and sports cars were icons of the good life, the Corvette, the Mustang, the Camaro. Well, in the 70s, those cars now became liabilities. One of the responses to the energy shocks of the 1970s was the decline of the American auto industry that was making such large cars that were fuel inefficient. Americans abandoned those cars and they bought Datsuns, as it was known then, Hondas and Toyotas, which were smaller four-cylinder cars, very fuel efficient. And that only, of course, hurt the American auto industry and the broader economy as a result. So it was an era where Americans were now seeing the end of that aspect of the post-war ideal, the big gas-guzzling American car. Because now they couldn't afford the car, or even if they had the car, they could not drive 55, as Sammy Hagar sang in the 1980s. President Carter became a model for the conserve approach, this idea of conservation. He installed solar panels on the White House, making the People's House this icon of the new energy, the renewable energy. He was famous for urging Americans to turn down their thermostats and put on a sweater. When he would hold press conferences or address the nation from the White House, he was often filmed in a sweater. This was part of his folksy sort of Mr. Rogers attitude. Carter was elected in 76. He was elected after a series of American traumas, the loss in Vietnam, Watergate, the flagging economy, and he had this sort of soothing way to him. He was a former, and really remains to this day, Sunday school teacher. He still teaches Sunday school in Plains, Georgia. So he had this sort of folksy, kind of Mr. Rogers Sunday school persona that was very soothing and healing after the traumas of Watergate. That's part of his appeal and how he rocketed from obscurity from Georgia to the White House. But he also wore that sweater as part of his message of conservation. But as much as Carter became an embodiment of restraint and conservation, as he himself wore a sweater, turned down the thermostat in the White House, installed solar panels on the White House as part of his embrace of new forms of energy that will be needed in an America where oil becomes scarce and expensive. Despite him being a model of those responses in the consumer realm to the new reality of limits, all this got him was rebuke and mocking. As someone who seemed to, again, embrace restraint and limits. American consumers by the 70s had come to understand the American dream as one of endless abundance. Think back to all of those images we had in the lectures on the 50s and 60s. Cars, the television, the suburban home, that image of abundance, the good life. America's free because we can choose any mixer blender we want. In the 70s, that no longer seemed to be the case. And when Carter embraced that and tried to urge American consumers to also embrace austerity and limits, well, it made him very vulnerable to the attacks from Reagan and others that he was accepting the American decline. And then you couple that with the hostage crisis in Iran, the failed effort to free those hostages. Carter was very ripe for such criticism. Reagan runs in 1980 with all of this and defeats Carter. And when Reagan wins in 1980 and ushers in a very conservative period in American life, one of the first things he does is rip down those solar panels off the White House. We're not going to go solar. And that probably explains a great deal of where we are today in regards to our inability to really transition towards green energy. Part of what has limited our embrace of green energy is the sense that it is accepting the era of cheap gas and cheap oil. Carter seemed to be doing so with his embrace of conservation, and American consumers didn't like that because it seemed to, again, signal the end of abundance, the end of an economy based on cheap gasoline. It seemed another indication of America's weakness and impotence. Americans didn't want to be told by their government how fast they could drive and to put on a sweater. They wanted a return to that era of abundance that now again seemed to be slipping away. The great beneficiary of all this, again, the fossil fuel industry, which in the 70s, 80s, and 1990s would benefit from deregulation and a rollback of a lot of the environmental restraints that had been in place in the 60s and early 70s. So though America was increasingly dependent on foreign oil, the response was to expand domestic production, and that led to a great reversal of many of the environmental laws that had been in place in a different period of the 1960s when a more regulatory sensibility prevailed. Well, in the 70s, Americans, again, facing this squeeze in their family budget, embraced this idea of liberating the coal, the natural gas, and oil industry from those strictures in an effort to revitalize an American economy based on cheap oil. They didn't want to drive 55. They didn't want to turn down their thermostat. They wanted to be Americans. We don't conserve. We don't recycle. We spend, baby. And America was eager to spend again, and therefore found itself embracing this idea of deregulation. And we cleave back to that 1920s ideal that what's good for big business is good for us all. Americans were convinced of that in the 70s and onward, that if we just free the oil industry from these pesky environmentalists, well, the good life will return. Americans were eager for that amidst the very difficult economy of the 1970s. A new word entered the American vocabulary in the 1970s that expressed this new economy of economic misery: stagflation. Stagflation was a new word coined in the 70s. It's a hybrid of the word stagnant and the word inflation. Economics 101 teaches us that in times of a strong growing economy, prices go up. People have more money to spend and goods are increased in demand, and so prices go up. In times of a bad economy, prices go down. As we talked about much earlier in the class, in the Great Depression, you saw this precipitous decline in prices, massive deflation, as one of the hallmarks of the diseased, flawed economy of the 1930s. So basic economics says good economy, high prices, bad economy, low prices. But in the 1970s, you had the worst of both worlds. You had stagflation, a stagnant economy where jobs are not increasing, the economy is not growing, coupled with massive increases in prices, thanks to, again, the effects of these energy shocks on the American consumer. So your job is unsteady, you are facing potential layoffs, you don't get a raise, and meanwhile everything costs more. That was stagflation, this new word that entered the American vocabulary. Massive inflation in the 1970s, most of it fueled by the energy shocks of this period, coupled with very anemic growth. So American workers, consumers, 1970s faced this very terrible economy, coupled with all the other traumas and defeats and disappointments of the 1970s. Is there any wonder so much of American consumer culture in the 70s and movies and the like were so bleak? Americans in that bleak era faced rising prices and declining fortunes in their incomes. Another new term that was coined to express this new reality that, again, must be understood in context. All this happens after that period of relative affluence we've been talking about. So this was a great shock, a great trauma to Americans who imagined that they would live as their parents had lived in the 50s and 60s. Instead, now they face stagflation and another term coined, the misery index, which is the sum of the unemployment rate plus the inflation rate. In 1970, the misery index, which wasn't even measured then because it was 1970 and still we were in boom times, was 10.8%. Certainly manageable, right? Low unemployment and inflation largely in check. But by 1980, the misery index had more than doubled, so that you had double-digit unemployment coupled with double-digit inflation. It was really a terrible time, which again played a key role in the defeat of Jimmy Carter, the incumbent president. Incumbents usually win. But Carter was defeated in 1980, in part because of a third-party candidate that most historians agree took votes away from him, but also the terrible economy coupled with the crisis in Iran and the rejection of Carter's idea of putting on a sweater and turning down your thermostat. I mentioned this earlier, but it's very important to note because it plays such a central role in all these developments. When Americans were facing increasing gas prices, they rejected the big tuna boat sedans being produced by Ford, GM, and Chrysler, fuel inefficient cars. And they bought Japanese and German cars, Volkswagens, Hondas, and Toyotas, which were much more fuel efficient. Well, that makes sense. That's a smart consumer decision, right? Why buy an expensive gas-guzzling car when there were these alternatives now? Alternatives that, again, came from global competition, from countries that, again, we rebuilt after World War II, Germany and Japan. Don't buy a Ford, don't buy a GM, buy a Toyota, Datsun, or Volkswagen. Well, that smart consumer decision was devastating to the American auto industry, which would see declining fortunes in this period, would see great crises. Chrysler ultimately has to be bailed out by the government in the early 80s. It's about to go bankrupt. And as a result, the American auto industry is losing money as more people buy Toyotas and Volkswagens. And what do? They lay off their workforce. They close their plants. And what does that do to this already existing economic misery? Well, it only compounds it. So a smart consumer choice to now embrace Japanese cars that were much more fuel efficient was devastating to what, as we talked about earlier, was a center of the American post-war economy, the American auto industry. And as we stressed throughout this class, when we first talked about the widespread availability of automobiles in the 20s, the rekindled love affair with automobiles in the 50s and 60s, the auto industry isn't just the auto industry. It's the steel industry, it's the electronics industry, it's the construction industry, it's the housing industry. Cars are at the center of so much of the American economy. So when the auto industry is ailing, everyone is ailing. So the effect of the energy shocks on oil, and with it the effects on the American auto industry, very demonstrative of the compounding, layered nature of the new economy that dawned in the 1970s. So with GM and Ford now facing competition from these fuel-efficient cars made in Europe and Asia, they closed their factories. They tried to rewrite union contracts so that union workers no longer have the job securities that they once had in the 50s and 60s. This is the stag and stagflation, a stagnant economy, rocked by global competition, skyrocketing energy prices, austere efforts by government to not now invest in massive government spending. So many markers of economic misery in a very different America that began in the 1970s and in many ways continues to this day, the new economy of the late 20th and early 21st century. By 1980, Japan had eclipsed the United States as the largest producer of automobiles in the world. In the 50s and 60s, when Japan first introduced cars, Americans laughed at them because they were small and underpowered, and they were actually considered unreliable. Of course, today we think of cars made in Japan as the most reliable. By the 70s and 80s, Americans were now willing to take a chance on Japanese cars, and they found them to be not just fuel efficient, but reliable. And so Americans abandoned their Ford and GM products and embraced the Japanese-made goods, the Japanese cars. 25%, 1 in 4 cars sold in the United States in 1980, made in Japan. The American auto industry was reeling beginning in the 1970s, now facing this competition from Japan. A term I've used previously and not yet defined is our focus here in this slide, and it's key to understanding not just these final 2 lectures, but the America you live in today. Deindustrialization. Deindustrialization refers to the decline of manufacturing, the decline of an economy centered on industrialization. Industrialization began in the United States in the early 1800s, early 19th century in northern states prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, industrialization became the rule, north and south, east and west. We have charted in this class the steady rise of an industrial economy beginning in the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, and flourishing in the early 20th century. As I mentioned previously in this lecture, in the 1950s, America made televisions, clothing, refrigerators, and automobiles we sold to the world. But beginning in the 1970s, that changes, and rather than export to the world, we began to import to the world. The decline of a manufacturing-based economy, with it the decline of jobs associated with that manufacturing economy, usually union jobs that offered you steady work, steady wages, a pension, benefits, early retirement, the key means by which Americans in the 50s and 60s, an era where 50% of the American workforce was unionized, could achieve the American dream. What's happened since the 70s is deindustrialization, the end of that, where manufacturing moves overseas. The clothes you are wearing, the computer you're using to listen to this lecture, the food you had for lunch, likely made outside this country. That contemporary reality, where our material consumer world is a product of globalization, where again, clothes you're wearing, the food you ate for lunch, the car you will later drive to work, were made outside this country, begins in the 70s. The decline in manufacturing and the shift towards a service sector economy. Today in America, most people don't go to a factory, turn bolts, and make something. They provide services. And the service sector economy has really two tiers. There's the high end, the top tier, the service sector economy. Medicine, law, accounting, programming. People who are computer programmers, people who are accountants, they don't make a tangible good. They don't turn a bolt and produce a tangible consumer good. They provide a service, but because their service requires expertise and education, they are well rewarded and they have a middle class lifestyle. The other tier, though, the service sector, are low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs in fast food, retail, hospitality, home health care. Today it's the gig economy, right? No job security, no benefits, poor wages. That's what's happened to the American economy since the 1970s, where Americans find themselves locked into one of those two tiers, where now if you have a high school diploma, good luck finding a good paying union job that can allow you to buy a house and send your kids to college. In the 50s and 60s, that was the norm. Beginning 1970s, that is now a rare exception. So you have the decline of manufacturing, you have the decline of those union jobs, and they're replaced by low pay, low prestige service sector jobs. If you can start to get your mind around this, the new America, the America we live in today, haves and have-nots, great disparities in wealth, starts to make greater sense. When American companies face competition, they often want to move manufacturing overseas. They want to close their plants, which are often employed by a unionized workforce, and move those jobs overseas where they could pay international workers a pittance, where they could often operate not just outside union rules and strictures, but outside environmental restrictions, so they can make cheap goods abroad. They move their factories overseas. And what does this do? Well, it compounds unemployment, the decline of the American union movement, and those people who see their factories close and move overseas find themselves working at McDonald's or Starbucks. The epicenter for deindustrialization, what are known as Rust Belt cities in the Midwest, what had once been the heart of the American industrial economy. Detroit, Motor City, USA, Chicago, Cleveland. In the early and mid 20th century, these were teeming, booming cities where people could find good paying union jobs, move off to the suburbs and live the American dream. These cities have been in decline over the last few decades because they've closed their plants and laid off their workforces. With that comes less tax revenue into Detroit, Chicago, and that means poorer schools, and with it, less economic opportunity for children growing up in those schools. Also, this means declining property values. You can buy a house in Detroit amidst the most recent recession, the one that began in 2008, for $20,000. Nobody wants to buy that house. So if you had bought that house, you are facing negative equity. You're facing declining economic fortunes. Of course, many of the residents of Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, these big industrial cities, were African Americans who headed to those cities in what's known as the Great Migration, the great exodus of African Americans out of the South to Chicago, to Cleveland and Detroit in the mid 20th century. They bought those homes that now are depreciating in price. They had to send their kids to those schools that were underfunded. So again, the great disparity in wealth, the racial gap in education, a lot of it again, a function of deindustrialization. Cities like Chicago, Flint, Michigan, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, in the 80s and 90s were chronically underfunded as they lost their tax base. They saw rising crime rates, and the investment in city government went to police forces that often mass incarcerated citizens who are the great victims of this economic decline. With declining tax revenue, not only did you have underfunding of schools and overfunding of police departments, but you had the decline of public sector jobs in government that also offered at one point good paying middle class jobs, union jobs. Now there were less government jobs, less public sector jobs as a result, as the cities of Chicago, Cleveland, and others lay off their city workforce, many of whom were also people of color. So the great urban crisis, the great decline of American cities here with deindustrialization. Where did people go? Well, many people went to Sunbelt states. Sunbelt refers to a great swath of the country from the Southwest, Southern California, through the American South. And a lot of those states saw a rise in population with an exodus out of cities as people headed to those states, which offered forms of manufacturing that often were without union protections and union rules. One of the responses that these foreign car companies have when they're under pressure from the U.S. government, who objects to their ability to now control the global force, things like tariffs. Well, this is one of the things that the American government did in response to competition from Toyota and Honda. They slapped big fat tariffs on Honda and Toyota products in an effort to discourage American consumers from buying Toyotas and Hondas. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. They too have been in the news a lot. So that imported things cost more. The whole idea is that, well, if it costs more to buy a Honda or Toyota, you're going to buy a Ford or GM. They're designed to protect native industry. Well, one thing that Honda and Toyota did was relocate their plants in the United States so that they would be American produced. If you have a Toyota or Honda, you might find that was made in Tennessee. Huge Toyota plant in Tennessee. And that was a way of getting around the tariffs and maintaining high sales, because now if the Toyota's made in Tennessee, it's not subject to a tariff. It's not an imported good. And then Tennessee and other Sunbelt states in the American South invited Toyota to come in because they said, we won't pass laws that require you to have a union. We won't have laws that, again, restrict your practices in terms of environmental regulations. And so Sunbelt states, particularly in the American South, became great magnets now for foreign companies who set up business to get around tariff laws and then also to get around union strictures and environmental regulations. And so people went to these southern states or to the Southwest. And what that has done is increase their political power. As their populations increase, they have more representatives in the House, more clout. And those states, for reasons that we're not going to get into, in American political history, are states that are largely conservative. And this has increased the political power of conservatives in this period, on top of many of the other trends we've talked about here that have also played a role in increasing the political power of conservatives, helping us understand why the late 20th century is a period of great ascendance. So another effect of deindustrialization was to aggrandize the power of conservative states and elect more conservatives to Congress who call for deregulation, efforts to deunionize, deregulate, all of these economic factors that have also played a role in declining fortunes for the American consumer and the American working class. You are better off being middle class in the 70s than you are today. Adjusted for inflation, middle-class Americans earn more in the 70s than they do today. Yes, in actual dollars, thanks to inflation, a middle-class family earns much more today in the 21st century than the 70s, but in real wages. Real wages means adjusted for inflation. You are better off in the 70s than you are today. We have seen little growth in real wages, adjusted for inflation. At the same time, everything associated with a middle-class lifestyle, everything associated with that post-war ideal has gone up in price. Housing, healthcare, education. In the 50s and 60s, the American ideal, the post-war ideal, was to own a house in the suburbs, take your kids on an annual vacation to Disneyland, buy a new TV, a new car every couple of years, and send your kids to college. Beginning in the 1970s, it has become increasingly expensive to do that. You guys are the meme generation. Thanks for that. That's your wonderful contribution to American culture. So you guys love to make these memes. Perhaps you've seen the meme, Old Economy Steve. You can Google this if it's now expired as a meme, replaced by all the SpongeBob memes that are much more popular. But for a while, there was this very popular meme called Old Economy Steve. It was an image of a guy named Steve from the 70s with his butt-cut hairdo and big lapels. So he looked like, a guy from, I'm sure they took this out of a 1970s high school yearbook. And the tagline in all these memes was, well, I bought my first house when I was 22. Well, yeah, in the 70s, you could buy a house at 22 because that house cost $30,000. Today, that same house cost $800,000. The meme Old Economy Steve had a tagline like, well, I paid for my college. Yeah, because it was $300 a semester in 1981, right? Today, it's much more expensive. So again, this helps you understand the America you live in today. Since the 1970s, we've seen little increase in real wages for middle-class Americans. At the same time, everything that defines the middle-class lifestyle, a house, an education, stable employment, has become harder to obtain. It costs more to buy a house. It costs more to send your kids to college, even though Americans are earning not much more than they did in the 1970s. For poor Americans, it's even worse. You were better off being poor in the 70s than today because you had more buying power in the 70s than today, owing to these changes in the economy, things like the rise of a service sector where people without a college degree find themselves in home health care, hospitality, retail, the gig economy. And adjusted for inflation, poor Americans, working class Americans, or those who meet the definition of under the poverty line, they actually had more buying power in the 70s than today. So this again explains the America we live in today that really began here in the 70s, particularly with deindustrialization, deunionization, and the rise of a two-tier service sector economy where if you graduate from college, you might have a chance to vault into the higher end of that service sector economy, work as an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, or if you don't, and all you have is a high school diploma, you'll find yourself again on the lower end where your fortunes continue to wane. We talked earlier about conservation as a strategy for dealing with the new economy of the 1970s. And it was a strategy that might have made sense, but actually made people angrier. They don't want to conserve. They don't want to turn their thermostat down. It seemed like a marker of American decline. Other strategies of coping with the new economy of the 1970s also prompted anger and disillusionment. One strategy for dealing with the new economy of stagflation, deindustrialization, was to turn to the two-income household. I mentioned this earlier in our lecture on fast food as one of the key developments of the 70s that really fuels the fast food industry. Part of this was due to feminism. Part of this was due to the really important, ambitious, and brave efforts of American feminists in the 60s and early 70s that pried open greater opportunities for women in employment and education. But another factor in the statistics you see here of the rise of women in the workforce was the trends in the economy we've enunciated in this lecture, where now to make the mortgage, make the rent, put food on the table, to keep gas in the car, you needed two incomes. There is this steady growth in the number of women in the workforce, including married women, including women with small children, who in the 50s and 60s may not have worked. Now, you have the return of the family income, where everyone needs to work. And that meant women in the workforce. Some of them, again, were pursuing a career as a result of the opportunities that feminism opened up, but many were finding themselves working in low-pay, low-prestige jobs because that was necessary to make some attempt to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. So one factor one response to the new economy was the two-income household, where now women are increasingly in the workforce. And some, again, were able to pursue professions, and you have that key aspect of modern American history, the rise of women. And I've mentioned this prior, that thanks to the efforts of feminism, today women are CEOs of corporations, women are on the faculty of prestigious universities, women are in many professions that they had been denied access to in the 50s. In some American households, women out-earn their husbands in increasing numbers. They are the breadwinners in American families as they have best adapted to the information age and service sector economy. But so many American women who don't have the education necessary to pursue these professional jobs find themselves in those miserable, low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs. Another response to the new American reality was the embrace of business as a major. This is something we've talked a little bit about, where in the late 19th century, for the first time, business schools are created, with Simon Patton helping to establish the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to that, business wasn't considered an intellectual pursuit. It wasn't considered something you had to study. You just do it. You open a business and learn from there. But in the 20th century, owing to the factors we've enunciated here, the embrace of big business and the consumer lifestyle and culture that develops in this period, business became a mainstay of a university education. And what we see in the 70s is a marked increase in those majoring in business or economics and a huge decline in people studying the liberal arts, philosophy, English majors decline, majors in the humanities. Now, in a previous lecture, we heard from William H. White, who said that the decline of the liberal education, liberal arts, I don't mean liberal in a political sense, but the liberal education ideal is the idea that you learn widely across the campus. You take a variety of different courses. You might be a business major, but you take history and philosophy and art because there's something very valuable to yourself and society in having well-rounded, thoughtful, educated individuals. Even if you're going to be a businessman, you benefit from reading Shakespeare and the experience of enslaved people in American history and the great works of American writers. Well, since the 70s, that model of education has declined. And now education is seen as a transaction where you are paying a lot of money and you're paying it to build skills rather than sensibilities and education and illumination for the workforce. William H. White sounded the alarm about that in the 50s, how it would make us all organization men, mindless cogs in a wheel, unable to think broadly, creatively, as we can through a liberal arts education. Well, by the 70s, White's fear had increasingly come true as we've reduced a college education to a transaction, a marketplace transaction, where we no longer think about education as something that is designed to cultivate the mind, illuminate, open many different possibilities. Instead, it's all about getting that good job, a job that seemed to be so scarce beginning in the 1970s. Another coping mechanism, credit, debt. The expanded use of credit cards. Now, another theme we've encountered in this class is how in the 20th century American attitudes about debt change. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, debt was considered a moral failing. If you were in debt, you were a bad person. You were sinful, indulgent, profligate. It was an indictment of your character. But in the 20th century, debt became something that people embraced as a vehicle to the good life. In the 19th century, if you're in debt, something's wrong with you. In the 20th century, if you're not in debt, something's wrong with you. So one of the threads, one of the themes of this class is how Americans were urged to think differently about debt in the consumer culture. Well, in the 70s, debt became increasingly important just to get by and to maintain that lifestyle. There is a huge increase in consumer debt beginning in the 70s as Americans facing stagnant wages, facing no real increase in real wages, coupled with now higher prices for housing, education, healthcare, turned to debt as a way to grasp and hold on to an American dream that again seemed to be slipping away. In the 1980s and 1970s, even prior, many states began to establish lotteries. This was because of declining tax revenue. With changes in the economy came less money coming into state coffers. And that meant, as I've mentioned earlier, disinvestment in public schools. One of the reasons why colleges and universities cost so much today is because the state is no longer funding them as we did in the heyday of the CSU and UCs in the 50s and 60s, when, believe it or not, it was free to go to a CSU or UC. You did not pay a dime. If your grades got you in, you didn't have to pay a dime. I know. Imagine such a world, right? Well, that's what history does. It forces you to imagine a very different time. When the CSU and UC systems were created, they were to be tuition free. They still are. You don't pay tuition, you pay fees. Isn't that nice? They got around it by just naming them fees. In the 50s and 60s, we invested heavily in our universities. We built more, like UC Riverside, and we subsidized them. We funded them. But in the 70s and 80s, owing to changes in the American economy and declining tax revenue, owing to a conservative trend that de-emphasized public spending, states were now facing budget deficits. And they turned to gambling to deal with that. They legalized lotteries in the 70s and 80s. California here in the early 80s legalized a lottery. I remember this, having grown up then, being a child of the 1980s, born in I remember when in the early 80s, California created the lottery. Back then they only had one game, one lotto, and one, scratch off or something. It was a big deal. And it was sold to California voters as this great benefit to schools. A portion of the lottery proceeds will go to schools. So this is how states like California, which once, as we talked about, was the model of public schools, public education, the CSU and UC systems, the envy of the world, a free college education for all citizens. That was California in the 50s and 60s. By the 80s, we had turned to legalized gambling to try to keep the lights on at the local elementary school. And this was sold to California voters as something necessary to pump more money through gambling into the state education fund. I remember as a kid in elementary school, once the lottery was established, one of my teachers showing off the file cabinets that she was able to buy thanks to the very generous funds that had come from the lottery. And she instructed all the kids, go home and tell your parents that I was able to buy this file cabinet. Looking at the time, I went home, you're a dumb shit kid, you do what the teacher says. Hey, guess what? Mrs. Heath was able to buy a file cabinet, right? I did it. I went home and I told my mom that the teacher was able to buy a file cabinet, thanks to the generous support of lottery players in California. Looking back on it now, I think Mrs. Heath, who was pretty smart, pretty astute, was sending a very coded but direct message to our parents. Yeah, that's all I got out of the lottery, a lousy file cabinet. Oh my, how your children will benefit from this gleaming, shiny file cabinet. I'm sure that's why I ended up with a PhD. It was that file cabinet that helped me in 8th grade, right? So California and many other states legalized lotteries as a way to deal with the declining revenue coming in an effort to put file cabinets in elementary schools in Southern California. But again, this demonstrates a very futile response. So desperate, we turn to gambling. This is not a way to grow the California dream by now encouraging Californians to throw their money away on the lottery. So many of these responses were inadequate to addressing the underlying problems in an American economy that was changing. Instead, Americans had to run up their credit cards, now work 2 jobs, and feverishly scratch off a lottery ticket, hoping that they would be the one who could finally once again live the good life. There was a syndicated show in the 80s hosted by David Horowitz, who just passed away a few months ago. I just read his obituary recently. It was based in Los Angeles, but became ultimately syndicated nationwide. And the whole premise of the show was that David Horowitz was going to expose all the lies and deception of advertising and other forms of business designed to gouge consumers. So Horowitz was sort of the next iteration of a figure we've met in recent lectures, the consumer advocate. He was the legatee, the heir to Vance Packard and Ralph Nader. But David Horowitz was a very different consumer advocate. His whole idea was fight back. They're coming to rip you off. They're going to get you, and I'm going to help you be informed. And so he would recreate commercials in a way to demonstrate the commercials were all a ruse. They were all a work. There was a famous igloo cooler commercial in the 80s where they would have an elephant stand on their cooler, and their cooler was tough. It could stand up to the weight of an elephant. And then David Horowitz would test that in the parking lot of his LA television station. So Horowitz's attitude was, you got to fight back. They're out to get you. It was very militant and individualistic, very much complementary to the me decade of the 1970s. It wasn't a movement like Nader, hey, let's get together, power to the people, bottom-up revolution, let's put pressure on these corporations, let's empower consumers, let's regulate. Horowitz's approach to consumer advocacy was you're on your own, and you better learn, you better arm yourself, you better fight back. It was the perfect iteration for a now individualistic, conservative me decade that now was so suspicious about the we sensibilities of the 60s, where people did band together and put pressure on government, pressure on corporations, pass that series of reforms. Horowitz didn't go on air and say, let's start a grassroots revolution. He didn't go on the air and say, let's put pressure on our leaders to pass laws that will improve the status and lives of American consumers. He told you to get angry. He told you to be mad. And so many of the responses to the new economy of the 1970s put the burden on you, the individual. Said you're the one who has to do the labor. You're the one who has to do the work to not get ripped off. Don't look to government. Don't look to social movements. Very indicative of, again, this me decade and the very conservative sensibilities of this period. In the 1970s, you'll really have great advances by the conservative movement that will, by the end of that decade, elect Ronald Reagan president of the United States. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about what Reagan did in the 80s amidst this new economy. So in the 70s, despite it being the era of porno chic, the era of disco and more libertine values, you had a very conservative trend in American politics. Some of this was disillusionment with the 60s. Part of this was a backlash to civil rights, feminism, gay rights. Part of this was the rising evangelical movement. And with it came an emphasis in the conservative ideology of less government, less regulation. We've talked about that in this lecture. And lower taxes. And in the 1970s, that became a very winning message to American workers and consumers who were being squeezed, who were facing declining wages. In earlier periods of economic distress we've encountered in this class, like the Great Depression, Americans looked to government as a solution. That was one of the great ideas, theses that we advanced in regards to the New Deal, that it restored people's faith in government. It showed government could work. It showed the American system could be responsive to the American people. In the 70s, in this conservative era, instead people were very critical of government and wanted to deregulate as well as lower taxes in an effort to reduce government spending. And so lower taxes became the solution that conservatives, so prominent and successful in the 70s, proffered to the economic crisis of this period. And that was appealing to Americans because they reasoned, well, if my taxes were lowered, I'd have more money. I'd have more money in my pocket. I could maybe pay the mortgage and deal with these declining fortunes. So it's the me decade. It's a decade that emphasized individualism, In some ways that led to, again, many of the fads in American consumerism of the 70s. The emphasis on the body, the emphasis on physical fitness. It certainly had a role in the sexual revolution and the embrace of our bodies, ourselves, and sex as a field of individual expression. But another element of the Me Decade was its emphasis on individualism and its suspicion about government, society, social movements. It was very critical of that we decade of the 60s, and with it came a backlash against government spending, government reform, and calls, therefore, for lower taxes. In 1978, California passed Prop 13, which dramatically lowered property taxes. And this is a very important part of, again, the world we live in today, particularly everyone in this class. This plays a key role in what I mentioned earlier in regards to lotteries, the defunding of American California public schools and universities. Beginning with Prop 13, you would see this precipitous decline in tax revenue for the state of California. And from this has come underfunding of our schools, colleges, and universities. Why do you pay fees? Because since the 70s, we've invested less in public universities and transferred the burden from the state, from the government, from the taxpayers to you, the students in this class. A big factor in that, Prop 13, where there's now less revenue coming in to the state of California because of declining property taxes. Property taxes are what we use to fund public schools in California. And Prop 13 dramatically lowered the tax rate, property tax rate. And California voters voted this in part because California was a hotbed of conservatism in this period. It's a state that gave you Richard Nixon and the adopted state of Ronald Reagan. The modern conservative movement was born here in Orange County and then in Empire and San Diego. It was funded by people like Carl Karcher of Carl's Jr. and other Republican officials and magnates, business magnates. So the modern conservative movement was born here in California. You know, we have this image today of California as, hippy dippy California, left coast, blue state. That's a very recent development. Up until very recently, California was a red state. We had Republican governors up until the early 21st century. And in the 70s, it was a hotbed of conservatism, and it really became the symbol, the tax revolt, here in this copy of Newsweek from the 70s, with Prop 13. Now, Prop 13 has been a huge boon to businesses. Who's really benefited from Prop 13? Businesses. Prop 13 sets your property tax, and it only reassesses your property tax when you move. So if someone sells the property and someone else buys it, well, they pay the property tax at the new price, which probably is a lot more. So the house you might have bought in the 70s for $30,000, when you sell it and someone buys it for $800,000 or $1.5 million, whatever it would be, they're going to pay property taxes at that new price. Well, businesses move much less often than residents. In California, we move a lot. It's the California lifestyle. It's the California dream, right? People are always trying to move up, flip houses. They're trying to buy a starter home and then later buy their dream home. America's religion is real estate. That's what we really worship, right? I mean, we do have cable channels in this country dedicated to watching people buy a house, turn around and flip the house, right? As if that's entertainment, something to watch, right? And perhaps nowhere else is that true, more so than California. So Californians move a lot, and when you move and buy a new house, you're subject to increases in your property taxes. But the big businesses in California who have maybe owned property in California for decades, they're not moving. And so they're locked into the property tax of 1978. That's why right now there's this effort that will soon be on the California ballot to exempt businesses from the property tax protections in Prop 13 here now 40 plus years later. So the tax revolt is very illuminating. It shows, one, the rise of conservatism in the 70s, and it shows another response by working class and middle class Californians, and nationwide in many ways as well, to the way in which their family budgets are squeezed, that they see declining fortunes. And when conservative politicians say to them, hey, we'll lower your taxes, well, that sounds good to me. If my taxes are lowered, I'll have more money in the family budget. Well, what does this mean? Well, it's related to many of the threads and ideas we've peppered into this lecture. When California is now facing lower tax rates and less tax revenue, well, the price of that university education goes up. It becomes harder and harder to secure that emblem of middle-class life. There's now defunding of cities, defunding of schools, and that only compounds the misery as people get less education. There's fewer county services, city services available. So what might seem like a smart reaction, hey, lower my taxes, I'll have more money, has only made things worse, as funds for public services, including public education, have declined dramatically, as the burden for funding has transferred from the state to the tuition or fee paying public, and every quarter, every semester, it seems like those fees go up. And that means fewer and fewer Californians, fewer and fewer Americans can get that college degree and have a chance at the higher end of the service sector economy. So again, this is very penny wise and pound foolish, but one of the responses here to the new economy of the 1970s. California, beginning with Prop 13, would go from budget surpluses, which it would enjoy through the 50s and 60s, where every year they brought in more revenue than they spent and invested that in roads, in colleges, universities, and K through 12 education, to what seems to be the perennial problem every year of budget deficits and scrambling to figure out a way to keep the lights on at UC Riverside. Let's summarize what we've talked about here as we've examined the 1970s. It's been a period of dramatic changes in the economy. Stagflation, deindustrialization, jobs moving overseas, massive inflation, rises in prices, and desperate efforts to deal with this that often made the problem worse. It's also the era of rising conservatism, the me decade, a sense that the American dream is in decline, and looking for hope, Americans turn to the conservative movement as a solution. It offered lower taxes, less regulation. If we could free businesses from onerous regulations, a booming economy will return. If we could lower taxes, there'd be more money to invest, and a rising tide will lift all boats. Also related to this is the emphasis on individualism that we talked about in cultural artifacts of this period, like David Horowitz's Fight Back. Dog eat dog, competition, individualism, everyone out for themselves. So this period of the 1970s politically saw a great increase in clout for conservatives and will lead to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and usher in another period that we'll examine in our next lecture, where once again the American worker and consumer is facing difficult and dire times. The changes in the economy in this period led to this increase in political clout for conservatives. Their prescriptions, lower taxes, less regulation, may have benefited certain sectors of the American economy, but other elements of the American dream were unaffected or further in decline with this disinvestment in public education and public services. So in this first look at the new economy that begins 1970s, we've summarized a very different America than has prevailed in our recent lectures on the post-war economic boom. In 1980, Ronald Reagan runs at a moment where conservatism is on the rise, and he says, I've got a plan to restore the good life. When Ronald Reagan ran in 1980, one of his slogans was, "Make America Great Again." Yeah, Trump stole that from Reagan. Reagan was the first to use it. And he was making that appeal to make America great again. In this context, we've now sketched out in this lecture, where there's a sense that America isn't great. It's in decline. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the Reagan era and document whether or not America truly becomes great again.